Hey guys, tonight we wander into the foggy rivers of medieval Europe, where warriors did something odd with their most prized possessions. Imagine you've got a gleaming sword that has carried you through battles, survived skirmishes, maybe even scared off a neighbor's goat that got too close to your garden. Instead of hanging it proudly on your wall or passing it to your kids, you walk down to a riverbank, take a breath, and toss it straight into the water. Splash! There goes your fortune, your honor, your Uber ride home if steel counted as currency. You probably won't survive this decision financially, but warriors really did it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture yourself on the muddy banks of the River Thames in the 10th century. It's cold, mist curls low, and you're holding a sword that costs more than your whole hut. Yet you don't hesitate. Splash, gone. Modern archaeologists, poking around centuries later with their waterproof gloves and very patient trowels, keep finding these blades lying at the bottom of rivers and lakes. Some are bent, deliberately destroyed before being offered to the water. Historians still argue whether these were sacrifices to gods, symbols of farewell for dead warriors, or maybe just very clumsy accidents. Personally, if I dropped my iPhone in the river, I'd also claim it was an offering to mystical forces rather than admit butterfingers. The mainstream fact is undeniable. Countless medieval swords have been found underwater across Europe, from the Thames to Scandinavian lakes. They weren't junk swords either. Many were ornate, decorated with precious metals, and clearly valuable. You can almost hear the splash echoing through time, followed by the collective groan of the warrior's descendants, who'd rather inherit a shiny blade than soggy river sediment. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Not just swords, but helmets, shields, even entire boats ended up in watery graves. The Vikings, for instance, had a habit of launching ships carrying the dead, sometimes with swords inside out to sea. Sometimes they even burned them, which feels like throwing your gaming console into a bonfire just to show you're serious about grief. You trudge further down this riverbank in your mind and notice how the water reflects moonlight. Ancient people often saw rivers as doorways to other worlds, places where spirits lingered and gods listened. It wasn't just superstition. It was a worldview in which natural landscapes pulsed with meaning. A sword wasn't metal, it was part of your soul. If you retired it into the water, maybe you hoped to balance debts with the divine. And hey, better than balancing actual debts with the tax collector, those guys didn't take swords as payment. Of course, not everyone agrees on the ritual angle. Some scholars insist these river swords were just the medieval equivalent of lost luggage. Picture a knight tumbling off his horse mid-battle, his sword flying into the river. Oops. You can imagine him fishing around for it, muttering curses, before giving up. Later, archaeologists dig it out and call it sacred. Historians still argue whether this whole practice was deliberate ritual, accidental loss, or a mix of both. As you shuffle further along in your imagination, your boots sinking in imaginary medieval mud, you find another fascinating layer. When archaeologists clean these river swords, they often discover they're in surprisingly good shape. Cold water and low oxygen preserve them better than dry soil. It's like medieval vacuum sealing. Submerge it in nature's fridge, and centuries later, it still shines. One blade pulled from the Thames in the 1800s was so pristine that museum workers joked it looked like it was waiting for a knight to pick it up and clock in for work. And let's not ignore the occasional sprinkle of myth. Think of King Arthur's Excalibur, given by the Lady of the Lake. That tale might feel like fantasy, but it echoes real traditions of putting weapons into water. When later storytellers spun Arthurian legends, maybe they weren't inventing the lake bit. They were remixing an old truth. You can almost see Arthur standing on the shore, hand outstretched, and instead of a mystical woman rising from the depths, it's just a drenched archaeologist shouting, "Found another one!" Now close your eyes and imagine how these rivers must have looked centuries ago. Not just water flowing, but glittering with unseen treasures below. Swords resting silently, blades pointing toward nothing, their owners long forgotten. Every splash was a story, every ripple a goodbye. Maybe it was grief, maybe devotion, maybe butterfingers, but each weapon still whispers through the mud. And you, wandering this dreamlike riverbank tonight, get to feel that echo. You bend down, touch the surface, and wonder what waits beneath your fingertips. A bent blade? A shield rim? Or just the chill reminder that people once tied their identity so tightly to an object of war that letting it go meant sending part of themselves into the deep. So next time you drop your keys down a storm drain, remember, you might just be continuing an ancient ritual. It won't impress the medieval gods, but hey, it keeps the tradition alive. You leave the rivers behind, and your imagination carries you into a crooked little village square in early modern Europe. The cobblestones are slick from last night's rain, chickens peck in the mud, and every villager is staring at a trembling man in chains. His crime? Not theft, not treason. He's accused of being a werewolf. Yes, a full-time, fur-covered, moon-howling wolfman. You feel the hush of the crowd and wonder, do these people actually believe a guy can sprout claws and rip livestock to pieces? The chilling part, they really did. Werewolf trials actually happened, and not just as bedtime campfire tales. From France to Germany, courts recorded cases of men, and occasionally women, being tried for shape-shifting into wolves. Some were even executed. Historians still argue whether villagers truly thought these people became beasts, or whether the werewolf label was shorthand for dangerous murderer who acts like an animal. Either way, the accused didn't exactly get fair defense attorneys. Your Honor, my client has paws only metaphorically wasn't going to save anyone. One mainstream fact that makes your skin prickle. The 16th century trial of Peter Stump, sometimes called the Werewolf of Bedburg. This German farmer was accused of making a deal with the devil and transforming into a wolf. Court records describe him confessing, under torture, naturally, that he killed and ate people while in beast form. The villagers were so horrified that his execution became a grisly public spectacle. You'd almost wish he had just confessed to jaywalking instead. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Some supposed werewolves were identified because of scars or missing limbs. One legend says a man's paw was cut off by hunters, and the next day he appeared in town missing a hand. Voila, instant evidence. You imagine people gasping, "Look, proof!" While the poor guy probably just wanted to explain a farming accident. It's the medieval version of blaming your cousin for stealing cookies just because he has crumbs on his shirt. As you shuffle closer into this eerie courtroom, you notice how much it feels like a witch trial. Lots of pointing fingers, fearful testimonies, and very little actual evidence. Werewolves, witches, and other night creatures were often lumped together in the same web of paranoia. Sometimes the accused were outsiders, the unpopular, or simply the unlucky neighbor whose sheep wandered into the wrong field. Being hairy probably didn't help. You glance at the villagers' faces and realize they aren't just scared of wolves. They're scared of the wilderness itself. The forests of medieval Europe weren't nice weekend hiking trails with coffee shops at the entrance. They were vast, dark, and filled with real wolves. You hear the howls at night, and suddenly blaming a neighbor for supernatural wolf crimes seems oddly reassuring. At least you can punish him, unlike the shadowy pack slipping through the trees. Historians still argue whether belief in werewolves was a genuine superstition or just a cultural tool to manage fear of predators and outsiders. And don't forget the occasional medical explanations. Some scholars today point to conditions like hypertrichosis, where a person grows excessive hair, or rabies, which makes people bite and act strangely. Imagine being sick with rabies, foaming at the mouth, and then the town whispers, "See? Told you he's a wolf." Talk about the worst time to ask for sympathy, but the strangest twist of all is that not everyone accused of being a werewolf resisted. Some leaned into the identity, bragging or confessing under pressure that they had prowled as beasts. Whether they truly believed it or just figured it was easier to say yes while under torture, we'll never fully know. You can almost hear a weary villager sigh. "Fine, I'm a wolf, just stop twisting my arm." Now picture yourself wandering out of that trial into the night. The forest looms on the horizon, and the moonlight spreads across the clearing. You wonder if the villagers see the same glowing orb and think of it as a spotlight for hidden monsters. You're tempted to laugh, but a part of you wonders, if you lived here, in this fear-saturated world, would you feel claws scratching in your own imagination? And here's your light joke to keep things balanced. At least no one accused their dog of being a secret human. Can you imagine medieval people trying to put Rover on trial? The evidence is clear. He sat at the table once and begged for bread. Your steps crunch the gravel as you leave the square, the crowd dispersing behind you. The accused man's fate is sealed, whether guilty or not, and you realize something sobering. Werewolf trials might sound absurd now, but to those villagers, they were deadly serious. It wasn't about the fur, it was about the fear. So as the night air cools, you glance up at the moon yourself and whisper, "Just in case, I'm not a wolf." Good to cover your bases. You drift away from the haunted village square and make your way toward the looming shadow of a stone fortress. Its towers scrape the twilight, banners flap lazily in the wind, and the walls look impenetrable, like a medieval version of your neighbor's Wi-Fi password. You crane your neck, marveling at the sheer thickness of the masonry, and wonder how on earth anyone ever snuck in or out. Then a guard yawns above you, totally oblivious to what lies beneath his boots, a hidden tunnel. Yes, those secret passages under castles weren't just legend. Archaeologists have confirmed them again and again, finding shafts carved into bedrock, narrow corridors running under moats, and trapdoors cleverly concealed in chapels or wine cellars. You imagine crouching low, torch in hand, sliding into the earth while your heartbeat echoes like a drum. This isn't Harry Potter mischief. It's real medieval escape planning. One mainstream fact, Dover Castle in England has an entire network of underground tunnels, expanded across centuries, some even used during World War II. Originally, they weren't just for storage. They were built for soldiers to slip out during a siege. You picture knights clanking quietly down there, praying their armor doesn't sound like a dropped drum kit. The quirky tidbit, some tunnels were so small, you'd have to crawl on your stomach, dragging yourself inch by inch. Not exactly glamorous. Imagine risking your life in battle only to get stuck like Winnie the Pooh in a rabbit hole. Sorry, my lord, can't help defend the castle. Hips too wide for the escape hatch. As you shuffle mentally through one of these damp corridors, you feel the cold stone brushing your shoulders. The air is stale, smelling of mold and torch smoke. It's unnerving, yet ingenious. Historians still argue whether most of these tunnels were primarily escape routes, secret supply lines, or just overbuilt wine delivery systems for lords who didn't want to wait for dinner. And castles weren't alone in this trick. Some medieval monasteries and towns had underground routes linking important buildings. Think of them as early VIP passageways, perfect for dodging sieges, fires, or just awkward social encounters. Oh no, here comes the tax collector. Quick, through the tunnel. Not all tunnels were about fleeing danger, though. Some served offensive strategies. Siege attackers sometimes dug under walls, setting fires at the base to make the whole structure collapse. It's a method called sapping. You crawl underground with pickaxes, gnawing away at the earth, while defenders above pour water or oil into counter shafts to smoke you out. It was basically medieval minesweeper, except instead of losing a game, you risked being buried alive. But the most enchanting angle is how these tunnels fueled legends. Local villagers would whisper of ghosts that slipped in and out, or kings with trap doors to dungeons full of treasure. The line between engineering and fairy tale blurred quickly. You can almost see children daring each other to creep into a half-collapsed shaft, swearing they heard a knight's footsteps echo in the dark. Now pause and picture yourself as a servant in one of these castles. You're fetching wine late at night, you stumble on a door hidden behind a tapestry, and curiosity wins. You light a candle, step inside, and suddenly the corridor slopes down into darkness. You hold your breath, half thrilled, half terrified. Where does it lead? Outside the walls? Into a chapel? Into someone else's dinner? Here's your playful modern joke. These tunnels were basically the medieval version of an incognito browser tab. Want to sneak around without being seen? Hit the underground. And yet, not every tale holds water. Some villages invented fake tunnel stories to boost tourism centuries later. Yes, our castle has a secret passage stretching 5 miles to the abbey. only for modern surveys to reveal it was just an old drainage ditch. Historians still argue whether certain claims are genuine discoveries or just clever marketing by people who couldn't compete with Disneyland. Still, many authentic shafts remain, some rediscovered only recently. At Nottingham Castle, for instance, archaeologists found a passage used during the 1330 coup when young King Edward III and his allies snuck in to arrest his mother's lover. It worked too, proof that these tunnels weren't just decoration. They shaped history. As you emerge in your imagination from one of these shadowy escape routes, you blink in the moonlight, grateful for fresh air. Behind you, the tunnel mouth gapes like a stone secret that has kept its stories locked away for centuries. And you realize every fortress had two faces, the proud towers that boasted of strength above, and the nervous, practical lifelines snaking below. So next time you walk into a basement and see a suspicious, drafty corner, remember, you might not just be standing on an old crawl space. You might be standing on the entrance to someone's last hope of freedom. And let's be honest, if your house had a medieval escape tunnel, you'd use it every time someone rang the doorbell uninvited. You climb out of that secret tunnel, brush the dust from your cloak, and step into a bustling town square. But something is very wrong here. Instead of the usual chatter of merchants or the clip-clop of horses, the air is filled with music, laughter, and the shuffle of hundreds of feet. People are dancing. At first it looks fun, like a festival, but then you notice the wildness in their eyes. They're not stopping. Their faces are pale, sweat dripping, legs jerking like marionettes. You've stumbled straight into one of the most baffling medieval mysteries, the dancing plagues. Yes, this really happened. In 1518, the city of Strasbourg witnessed dozens, then hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Some danced for days, collapsing from exhaustion, some reportedly dying right there in the square. This isn't just folklore. The events are recorded in city archives. You can almost hear the bewildered council scribbling, "New ordinance, no more music, please." One mainstream fact: officials in Strasbourg actually hired musicians to keep the dancers going, thinking the frenzy needed to be danced out like poison sweat. Imagine responding to a crisis by adding more hype. It's like giving free Red Bulls to people who already can't sit still. Here's your quirky tidbit: the city even rented out guild halls so the dancers wouldn't clog the streets. That's right, the medieval solution was basically open a nightclub for the cursed. You picture exhausted peasants being herded into a hall with drummers pounding away, everyone hoping the madness would eventually burn itself out. But what caused it? Historians still argue whether the plague was mass hysteria, a neurological disorder, or ergot poisoning, the hallucinogenic mold that grows on damp rye. Ergot is chemically similar to LSD. So imagine biting into your breakfast bread. Then 3 hours later, you're raving to imaginary beats only you can hear. You wander through the scene carefully, trying not to get swept into the moving crowd. A woman twirls past, her skirts flaring, then she stumbles, only to be dragged back up by the rhythm as if invisible strings tug her upright. Children gawk from doorways, priests cross themselves, and doctors shrug helplessly. No medieval remedy seemed to stop the dance. And this wasn't just Strasbourg. Reports of dancing mania pop up across Europe during the Middle Ages, often near the feast day of St. Vitus. People believed he had the power to curse or heal through dance. Hence the term St. Vitus dance, which stuck around for centuries. Picture villagers kneeling at his shrine one week, then break-dancing uncontrollably in his honor the next. If TikTok had existed back then, these plagues would have gone viral in the worst possible way. Some scholars think these events were partly social release. Imagine living through famine, plague, and war. The stress had to burst somewhere. What better than a mass freakout disguised as divine punishment? Others suggest it was communal trance, something like religious ecstasy. Still, nobody agrees fully. Historians still argue whether these outbreaks were neurological, psychological, or spiritual phenomena, or all of the above. And here's where your imagination takes a darker turn. You watch as a man collapses mid-spin, his body twitching, yet others just keep circling him like he's part of the choreography. The music pounds, the dancers cry out, some in joy, some in terror, but none can stop. The square becomes a stage of human puppets, caught in a loop no one controls. Now add a sprinkle of humor to ease the tension. If this had happened in your neighborhood today, someone would absolutely set up a lemonade stand to profit from it. Get your cold drinks here, keeps you moving longer. Medieval capitalism at its finest. As night falls in Strasbourg, the dancers keep swaying under torchlight, their shadows jerking across walls. You slip quietly down a side street, your heart unsettled. Was this illness, mass delusion, or some strange doorway to the divine? The truth may never be fully known, but the echoes of those stamping feet still thrum in history's memory. And as you walk away, you notice your own foot tapping to an imaginary beat. You stop instantly. Best not to test fate. You edge away from the frenzy of stamping feet, ears still ringing with phantom drums, and soon the sound fades into hushed whispers. You've wandered into a monastery courtyard where hooded monks huddle in the torchlight. Their voices are low, their eyes darting, and you lean in to catch the words. They're murmuring about a cup. No ordinary cup, but the cup. The Holy Grail. A vessel said to hold the blood of Christ, a relic so sacred it could heal, bless, or curse, depending on who touched it. You settle onto a cold stone bench and realize you've stumbled into one of the most enduring medieval obsessions, the wandering rumors of the Grail. Now, you probably think of Arthurian knights riding off in shining armor on quests for the Grail, right? That's the Hollywood version. But medieval people actually believed in holy relics with equal intensity. Churches proudly displayed splinters of the true cross, saints' bones, even vials of holy tears. So the idea that a cup from the Last Supper might be floating around Europe didn't sound crazy at all. It sounded like the ultimate spiritual jackpot. One mainstream fact: the earliest written mentions of the Grail appear in 12th century French romances, like Chrétien de Troyes' poem. But the tale snowballed. Within a century, the Grail became central to the Arthurian cycle. Suddenly, knights weren't just jousting and rescuing maidens, they were hunting a cup with cosmic importance. The myth tied perfectly into the medieval mood: salvation, mystery, and endless pilgrimage. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Multiple European churches still claim to house the Grail. One chalice in Valencia Cathedral, Spain, has been venerated for centuries. Another in Genoa, another in Leon. Honestly, if you lined them all up in a medieval tavern, you could stock a decent kitchen set. But each community swore their cup was the real one. You walk closer to the monks and notice how fervently they argue. Some insist the Grail is a literal cup. Others call it a metaphor for divine grace. Historians still argue whether the medieval storytellers meant it as physical relic or symbolic quest. But for knights and pilgrims, the line between symbol and reality was blurry. After all, if you believe saints' bones cure disease, why not a divine chalice? And oh, the journeys people made chasing it. Pilgrims trudged across dangerous roads, knights set off into unknown lands, and kings even commissioned searches. The Grail quest became not just a story, but a moral map. To seek it was to purify yourself, to renounce greed, and to prove your worth. Of course, some knights probably just wanted bragging rights. Imagine returning home with, "Guess what I found? Cup of Destiny. Beat that." But even outside the legends, relic hunts shaped politics. Kings who could claim to own holy artifacts gained legitimacy. Imagine being a monarch and saying, "Sure, my tax policy stinks, but behold, holy chalice." The crowd might forgive your economic blunders. The medieval marketing department was strong. You wander into the monastery's candlelit chapel, where one dusty goblet sits under glass. The monks bow reverently, yet even as you stare, you can't help thinking it looks suspiciously like the cup you used to rinse your toothbrush. Still, in this world, faith outweighs appearances. For them, the vessel's power lay in the story it carried. Humor break. If medieval villagers had eBay, they'd list every wine cup with the caption, "Rare, possibly the Holy Grail, no refunds." And yet, beneath the chuckles, there's something haunting about how these stories endured. Why did the Grail captivate so many minds for centuries? Maybe because it symbolized wholeness in a fractured world, hope in an age of famine, plague, and war. When life was brutal, the idea of a perfect, holy vessel felt like a promise worth chasing. As you step back into the night, leaving the monks whispering behind you, the Grail becomes less an object and more a mirror. You realize the power was never in the cup itself. It was in the human longing it represented. The longing to find meaning, to believe that somewhere out there, salvation had a shape you could hold in your hands. And then you smile, because if you'd been on one of those quests, you'd probably have mistaken the first tavern mug you found for the prize. Behold, the Grail still has ale in it. Not exactly the stuff of legend, but at least you'd quench your thirst. You leave behind the shadowy chapel and its suspiciously ordinary-looking chalice, stepping into the smoky haze of a battlefield camp. The clash of steel is still echoing in the distance, but here in the rear, you smell something even stronger than sweat and fear. Boiling herbs, sharp wine, and the unmistakable tang of fresh blood. You've arrived at a medieval surgeon's tent, where medicine looks less like sterile science and more like an experiment on wheels. Yet despite the chaos, you quickly notice something surprising. These battlefield surgeons weren't entirely the bumbling butchers we often imagine. Picture it. A soldier stumbles in, groaning, with an arrow jutting out of his thigh. The surgeon frowns, grips the shaft, and rather than just yanking wildly, he applies some very real techniques. One mainstream fact: medieval doctors knew how to cauterize wounds, stitch gashes, and even perform amputations with a terrifying kind of efficiency. They used cautery irons heated red hot, not because they were sadists, but because they understood burning sealed bleeding vessels. Not exactly gentle bedside manner, but hey, it worked. And then there's the quirky tidbit. Many surgeons actually used wine as a disinfectant. They didn't know about microbes, but they noticed wounds cleaned with strong drink fared better than those left bare. Soldiers might have groaned at losing their ale ration, but at least it doubled as first aid. Imagine being patched up and told, "Sorry, no pint tonight. We poured it on your leg." You watch the surgeon's hands move quickly. Assistants hold the patient down because, of course, anesthesia hadn't been invented yet. Well, unless you count herbal sleep potions or a whack on the head with a mallet. Some mixtures, like mandrake root combined with opium, were brewed into soporific sponges, held over the nose and mouth until the patient drifted into something like unconsciousness. Historians still argue whether these soporific sponges actually worked or were more wishful thinking. Either way, the screaming suggested they didn't always kick in on time. You step closer and see jars of strange ingredients lining a wooden table. Honey smeared onto wounds, an old trick that actually has antibacterial properties. Ground herbs mixed into poultices, some worthless, others surprisingly effective. In fact, the Anglo-Saxon medical text Bald's Leech Book describes a concoction of onion, garlic, wine, and bile for eye infections. Modern scientists recreated it in a lab and discovered it killed antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Suddenly, medieval medicine doesn't look so laughable. Of course, plenty of cures were hilariously questionable, like rubbing goose fat on frostbite or strapping live pigeons to plague boils. You try not to laugh as you picture some poor squire running around the battlefield with birds taped to his chest. Still, even the weird remedies were attempts at problem-solving, born from desperation and observation. The surgeon in front of you wipes sweat from his brow, pulls out a small saw, and prepares for an amputation. You brace yourself. The patient bites down on a leather strap, the assistants grip him tight, and the saw screeches across bone. It's brutal, yes, but quick, and sometimes life-saving. Infection often killed more soldiers than swords did, so losing a limb might mean keeping your life. Here's your lighthearted modern comparison. Complaining about waiting in an ER today suddenly feels ridiculous when you imagine lying on a wooden table in a muddy tent, praying the guy with the hacksaw had steady hands. And not all surgeons were common field hacks. Some, like Henri de Monville and Guy de Chauliac, were respected scholars who wrote detailed manuals. They studied anatomy, sometimes learned from translated Arabic texts, and even stressed cleanliness, though their definition of clean probably wouldn't pass modern inspection. Still, they paved the way for later breakthroughs. You linger in the smoky tent, listening to groans, smelling herbs and charred flesh, and you realize something profound. These surgeons walked a razor's edge between miracle and disaster. They lacked microscopes, sterile gloves, or antibiotics, yet they fought to save lives with what they had: steel, fire, and stubborn persistence. And here's a final quirky fact to tuck into your pocket. Some knights actually carried their own tiny medical kits, complete with bandages and ointments. Imagine strapping on armor, sword, and a medieval first aid kit. It's the ultimate be-prepared move, though I doubt it came with a medieval band-aid. As you step out of the tent into the cool night, you take a deep breath. The clash of battle still rumbles in the distance, but behind you, life and death decisions are unfolding in firelit shadows. And you realize with a shiver that medieval surgeons weren't just grim reapers in aprons. They were pioneers, straddling the blurry line between myth and medicine, improvising in ways that sometimes worked better than we'd like to admit. So next time you wince at a paper cut, maybe tip your hat to those who survived arrow wounds with nothing but wine, herbs, and sheer grit. And if a pigeon ever comes near you with a determined look, run. You leave the surgeon's smoky tent behind, still half hearing the rasp of that bone saw, and wander into a quieter road. The night feels eerie here, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Along the roadside, you spot children, thin, barefoot, clutching little bundles. They walk in ragged lines, eyes wide with a mix of hope and terror. You step closer and realize you're moving alongside one of the strangest and saddest tales of the Middle Ages, the so-called Children's Crusade. The year is 1212. Word spreads across Europe that armies of holy warriors, real crusaders, have marched to the Holy Land to wrest Jerusalem from Muslim control. But here, far from battlefields, a different kind of army gathers. Boys and girls, some no older than 12, are caught up in a whirlwind of faith and rumor. They believe they've been called by God to march east, singing hymns, their innocence destined to succeed where armored knights had failed. You glance at their dirty faces and realize this isn't just a bedtime myth. It's a recorded historical event, though wrapped in layers of mystery. One mainstream fact: chroniclers really did describe groups of children and adolescents gathering in France and Germany in 1212, claiming visions of divine missions. They set off in staggering numbers, thousands strong, expecting the Mediterranean to part for them like the Red Sea. The sources are fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, but the movement was real enough to terrify parents and intrigue church officials. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some accounts say when these kids reached the sea, instead of the waters parting, unscrupulous merchants offered them passage on ships. The vessels sailed, not to the Holy Land, but into slavery markets in North Africa. Others may have simply starved or drifted home again. Historians still argue whether this tragic twist really happened or if it was later moralizing propaganda to warn against youthful zeal. Either way, you shiver at the thought of a holy quest ending in chains. As you walk among the marching crowd, you hear their songs, thin, cracked voices echoing through the night. They carry crosses made of sticks, bread crusts in satchels, hope in their eyes. No armor, no swords, just conviction. Some villagers along the way cheer them, offering food, believing these little ones might succeed where adult armies had stumbled. Others watch grimly, knowing the road ahead devours even seasoned soldiers. You catch snippets of stories among the children. A shepherd boy named Stephen in France claims he saw visions of Christ urging him to lead. Another, Nicholas of Cologne in Germany, gathers his own following. Whether these boys were visionaries, manipulators, or simply swept up in collective hysteria, historians still argue. But their charisma was strong enough to send thousands of feet trudging eastward. The landscape shifts in your imagination. Dusty roads, blistered feet, empty bellies. Some collapse along the way, some turn back, yet others push onward, convinced every hardship is proof of divine testing. You can almost feel their determination pulsing like a heartbeat under the moonlight. Modern scholars suggest not all were literal children. The Latin word pueri used in Chronicles could mean children, or simply the poor. So perhaps this children's crusade was more like a mass of desperate peasants, young and old, united by poverty and faith. Still, the image of ragged boys and girls marching east has seared itself into memory, blending fact and legend until no one can quite untangle the two. And here's your bit of levity. Imagine being a medieval innkeeper when 100 starving kids show up demanding bread for the holy cause. That's the Middle Ages version of your worst school field trip nightmare. As dawn breaks in this vision, you walk among them, your own steps crunching gravel. The horizon stretches endlessly, yet the children keep trudging, propelled by something bigger than reason. They don't know the outcome, neither do you. All you know is that this march actually happened in some form, though its ending remains blurred in tragedy, rumor, and myth. Eventually you pause, watching the lines of children vanish into the haze. Their voices fade to faint echoes, then silence. And you realize the power of this story isn't in whether every detail is true. It's in what it reveals about medieval hope and desperation. That ordinary kids, or the poorest of the poor, believed they could rewrite history with nothing but faith in their hearts. And you whisper, almost to yourself, may their footsteps, whether misled or miraculous, remind us that history isn't just armored knights and kings. Sometimes it's barefoot children walking toward a horizon that never bends. You leave behind the echo of children's voices on dusty roads and wander into a dim, smoky chamber that smells of charcoal, herbs, and something suspiciously like rotten eggs. Tables are cluttered with glass vessels, bubbling liquids, and heaps of odd powders. A hunched figure in a hood stirs a pot with theatrical intensity, and for a moment you wonder if you've walked into a witch's kitchen. But no, it's an alchemist's workshop, and you're about to sift through a world where myth and science melted together like metals in a crucible. Most people picture medieval alchemists as quirky dreamers trying to turn lead into gold. And yes, that obsession was very real. But alchemy wasn't only about greed, it was a sprawling system that mixed spirituality, philosophy, and chemistry. You notice parchments pinned to the wall, covered with symbols that look like doodles from a sleep-deprived math student. Circles, triangles, squiggles, all believed to represent deep secrets of matter and spirit. One mainstream fact: alchemists did pave the way for chemistry. Their endless tinkering with substances led to discoveries about acids, salts, and distillation. Techniques like sublimation and crystallization, still used in labs today, were refined in those smoky chambers. Sure, they wrapped it in mystical language, but the hands-on experiments were real and practical. And here's your quirky tidbit. Alchemists sometimes used very odd ingredients. There are recipes calling for crocodile dung, ground-up mummies, and, brace yourself, urine, distilled and reused. Apparently, nothing said scientific progress like bottles of golden liquid lined up in the corner. You remember that sunscreen made of crocodile dung I mentioned earlier? Well, the trend of gross genius clearly had legs. You watch as the alchemist in front of you carefully pours one liquid into another. The flask glows faintly, and for a moment you feel like you might actually witness the philosopher's stone appear. This mythical object supposedly could transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. Historians still argue whether most alchemists literally believed in it or whether it was a metaphor for spiritual purification. Either way, entire lifetimes were spent chasing it. Some experiments had results that were unexpectedly useful. For example, alchemists developed mineral acids like hydrochloric and sulfuric, which became cornerstones of modern science. Gunpowder spread into Europe was partly through alchemical study. Suddenly, what seemed like quackery turns into groundbreaking invention. You realize that for every failed gold recipe, there might have been a hidden spark of discovery. And of course, secrecy was everything. Alchemists wrote in coded language to protect their great work. They didn't want rivals, or worse, suspicious authorities, catching on. So texts described procedures and allegories like the green lion devours the sun, which might just mean mixing vitriol with gold leaf. Imagine future scientists trying to decode your kitchen recipes if you wrote them like horoscopes. The workshop grows hotter, the fire in the furnace glowing red, and you step back as sparks fly. The alchemist barely flinches. His hands are scarred, his beard singed, but his eyes burn with obsession. He believes he's close, so close, to uncovering cosmic truth in the bottom of a flask. You sense how much faith these people had, how science and magic blurred seamlessly in their world. Here's your modern joke break. If an alchemist time traveled today, he'd either be amazed by a microwave or immediately try to sell you eternal life powder on Instagram. Some famous names drift through your thoughts. Jabir ibn Hayyan, often called the father of chemistry, whose works influenced both Islamic and European alchemy. Later, Paracelsus, a fiery Swiss thinker, turned alchemy toward medicine, mixing chemicals to treat disease instead of chasing gold. Not all of his cures worked, but he helped push alchemy toward pharmacy. Again, myth quietly feeding real science. Historians still argue whether the endless pursuit of gold was a waste or whether it was the necessary bait that kept people experimenting long enough to stumble upon genuine discoveries. Without that dangling dream of wealth, would anyone have endured the endless hours hunched over smoky furnaces? You glance once more around the chamber. Flasks bubble, vapors curl, and your eyes sting from the fumes. You realize these strange, stubborn seekers were the bridge between ancient mysticism and modern science. They never found eternal life, but they kept curiosity alive through centuries of darkness. As you step outside into the fresh air, you breathe deeply, grateful to leave the smell of singed eyebrows behind. And you smile thinking, maybe the real philosopher's stone wasn't a shiny rock after all, but the stubborn human desire to experiment, even if it means accidentally blowing up your workshop a few times along the way. You leave the smoky laboratory behind and walk into a wide courtyard, cobblestones glistening under a pale moon. A crowd gathers around a wooden barrier, murmuring with that particular mix of excitement and dread. In the center, two armored men stand, weapons in hand, breathing heavily. You suddenly realize you've stumbled into one of the strangest and most brutal legal systems ever devised: trial by combat. Most people assume knights fighting duels were simply about honor, pride, or maybe showing off for the local barmaids. And yes, those things happened. But here's the mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, trial by combat was sometimes an officially sanctioned way to settle disputes. Instead of proving innocence with witnesses or documents, you could literally fight it out, because God, people believed, would grant victory to the righteous party. Imagine taking a lawsuit today and resolving it with nunchucks in the parking lot. You watch as the two men circle each other. Their armor clanks, their swords catch moonlight, and the crowd goes silent. Every blow isn't just about strength, it's a legal argument. A swing, a block, a stumble. Each moment carries the weight of divine judgment. It's terrifying, and also slightly absurd. Now for the quirky tidbit, it wasn't only knights who fought. In some cases, even peasants could demand trial by combat, and the rules allowed for some bizarre scenarios. If a man accused a woman, she could fight him, but she'd be allowed to bury him waist-deep in a pit, armed only with a club, while she ran circles around him with a rock and a sock. Historians still argue whether these unequal duels really happened often or were more of a legal curiosity, but there are records suggesting at least a few were carried out. Picture it. Medieval home field advantage in action. The crowd around you roars as one knight stumbles, his sword scraping across the stones. He regains footing, lunges forward, and for a moment you forget this is supposed to be justice, not theater. But to the medieval mind, the two were the same. God's hand was believed to tip the scales of the fight. Of course, not everyone trusted this system. Some church authorities frowned on the practice, preferring trials by ordeal, like plunging your hand into boiling water and waiting to see if it healed cleanly. Somehow that was considered more civilized. Still, trial by combat lingered for centuries, and in some regions, it never fully disappeared. Here's your comedic breather. Imagine being a medieval lawyer. Instead of preparing briefs, you'd be sharpening swords. Your Honor, I move for a recess so my client can reattach his gauntlet. Famous cases did occur. One of the most notorious happened in France in 1386, when a knight named Jean de Carouge accused another man, Jacques Legris, of assaulting his wife. After endless back and forth, the king finally ordered a duel. In front of thousands of spectators, Carouge killed Legris. Because Carouge survived, the verdict was legally binding. His wife's testimony was considered true. Justice by sword point. Historians still argue whether such trials were effective deterrents or simply spectacles to entertain and terrify. Some say it upheld faith in divine justice. Others think it exposed the fragility of medieval law. Either way, the idea that your fate could rest on your sword arm and not on evidence makes your own legal problems seem laughably simple. The duel in front of you rages on. Sweat drips from steel helmets. Weapons clash. Sparks fly. Then with one desperate strike, one knight topples the other. The crowd erupts. The fallen man groans, defeated, while officials step forward to declare the verdict. The winner is righteous, the loser guilty. Justice is served, at least by medieval logic. You shiver, realizing how casually lives were decided in these moments. Yet you also can't help admiring the raw, unfiltered belief that the divine could be revealed in the chaos of combat. It's part brutality, part faith, and part circus. As the crowd disperses, you walk away from the blood-stained stones. The echo of clashing steel fades, replaced by your own steady footsteps. You remind yourself that though the weapons are gone, the fascination with trial by combat still lingers. Legal scholars debate it, movies glamorize it, and every so often, someone half-jokingly petitions modern courts to bring it back. Spoiler, judges always say no, but the fact that the idea hasn't fully died shows just how deeply the medieval mindset still echoes in us. You leave the echo of swords behind, the metallic tang of blood still hanging in the back of your throat, and follow a winding path into a quieter part of the village. The houses here lean slightly inward, thatched roofs sagging, smoke curling lazily from crooked chimneys. You duck under a low lintel and find yourself inside a dim cottage, lit only by firelight. The hearth glows orange, and on the mantel sits something odd. A squat glass bottle, stoppered with cloth, its contents rattling faintly when the wind shakes the beams. At first glance, it looks like junk, a vessel stuffed with nails, hair, and maybe a bent piece of leather. But as your eyes adjust, you realize you're staring at a witch bottle, one of the strangest and eeriest protective charms of the medieval and early modern world. These bottles weren't meant to be pretty. They were magical countermeasures, everyday people's DIY attempts at surviving curses and hexes. Here's the mainstream fact. Witch bottles were real. Archaeologists have dug them up beneath hearths and thresholds, some dating back hundreds of years. Their purpose was simple. If someone thought a witch had cursed them, they'd make a bottle filled with personal items like hair, nail clippings, or even urine. Yes, urine again. Apparently, medieval people were obsessed with recycling bodily fluids. Alongside those went sharp objects like pins, thorns, or shards of glass. The logic? The bottle trapped the curse and turned it back on the witch. And now for your quirky tidbit, one bottle discovered in England was filled with more than just nails and hair. It had a tiny heart-shaped piece of felt stuck with pins. Talk about a literal voodoo heart. Archaeologists still puzzle over whether it was symbolic or an improvised back-at-you hex. Either way, you can almost hear the desperate muttering as someone sealed that bottle, whispering prayers to make sure the bad luck didn't escape. You watch the woman of the house as she crouches by the hearth, slipping a fresh witch bottle beneath the warm stones. She does it quietly, almost nervously, as if the act itself might attract attention. Neighbors might laugh, priests might scold, but she isn't taking chances. You realize that in a world of plagues, crop failures, and sudden deaths, people needed a sense of control, even if it came in the form of a bottle stuffed with human toenails. Historians still argue whether these bottles were mostly psychological comfort or whether they actually formed part of a widespread, organized magical practice. Some suggest they were folk traditions whispered from family to family. Others believe they were desperate responses whipped up during panics about witches. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, suspended like the floating hair inside the glass. You lean closer to the bottle on the mantel. It's murky, the liquid inside thick and yellowish, nails pointing outward like a little medieval landmine. If curses were real, you'd definitely think twice before messing with the homeowner. But even if they weren't, the act of making such a bottle was powerful in its own way. A ritual that gave people courage against the unseen. And here's your comic relief. Picture the medieval version of an Amazon review. Witch bottle worked great. 5 stars, curse-free since Tuesday. Only downside, don't spill it on your rug. Other protective tricks existed too. Shoes hidden in walls, dried cats bricked up near doorways, even carved symbols etched into beams. All part of the same attempt, to create invisible shields in a world where invisible dangers seem to lurk everywhere. The cottage creaks, the fire snaps, and for a moment you imagine what it felt like to live here. Every cough might be blamed on a neighbor's curse, every spoiled pot of milk on some envious glance. In that climate, witch bottles were both a defense and a secret rebellion. They let ordinary people fight back when official religion told them they were powerless. You step outside, cool night air washing over you. The house behind you looks ordinary again, but you know beneath its hearth glimmers a small, sealed universe of fear and hope. It's easy to laugh at now, but you can't help respecting the creativity. After all, if someone believed you were cursed, wouldn't you want a glass grenade of nails and pee tucked safely under your fireplace too? You leave the smoky cottage and its hidden bottle behind, following the road until you hear a distant thunk, creak, whoosh. The ground trembles slightly, and as you crest a hill, the sight before you nearly knocks the sleepiness from your eyes. A towering wooden machine with a sling arm longer than a house. Men in tunics haul ropes, shouting in rhythm, as a massive stone is winched upward. Welcome to the world of medieval siege weapons. Machines so outrageous that for years, historians assumed many were exaggerations or tall tales. Here's your mainstream fact. These engines were not only real, but some were astonishingly effective. Catapults, trebuchets, and ballistae weren't Hollywood inventions. They smashed castle walls, lobbed fiery projectiles, and sometimes flung diseased carcasses over defenses to terrorize inhabitants. Yes, biological warfare, medieval edition. The machine in front of you is a counterweight trebuchet, the superstar of siege tech. Chronicles describe them hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds across hundreds of yards. Skeptics once dismissed these figures as impossible, until modern engineers built replicas and found the numbers surprisingly accurate. One recreated trebuchet in France called La Malice could launch a 300-pound stone more than 200 yards. That's not myth. That's medieval engineering flexing harder than your gym buddy bragging about his deadlift. And here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes projectiles weren't just rocks. There are accounts of beehives, barrels of snakes, and even decapitated heads being hurled. Imagine living in a castle, hearing the creak of a trebuchet, and then ducking as a buzzing, angry swarm rains from the sky. Not exactly covered in the Knights and Castles children's books. You watch as the soldiers finish winding the ropes. The massive counterweight drops, the sling releases, and the stone arcs like a comet, slamming into a distant wall with a crunch you feel in your chest. Dust clouds rise, cheers erupt, and the defenders on the battlements scramble like ants. Historians still argue whether some of the wildest reported siege weapons, like giant crossbows said to launch whole tree trunks, actually existed or were literary flourishes. Medieval chroniclers had a habit of inflating numbers, especially when trying to impress kings. Oh yes, sire, the enemy's machine could throw a boulder the size of your horse. Exaggerated, probably. But then again, so many impossible machines have been proven workable that it's hard to dismiss every tall tale. You wander further along the siege camp. Another machine catches your eye. A mangonel, smaller than the trebuchet but still impressive, with its tension arms bent back like angry fists. Its stones fly shorter distances, but at terrifying speed, cracking against shields and towers. Archers cheer each launch, knowing fewer enemies will be left standing after the bombardment. And let's not forget the medieval joke machine, the siege tower. Imagine rolling up to a fortress in what looks like a 3-story wooden apartment block on wheels. Defenders rain arrows and boiling oil on it, while inside, attackers pant and shove it forward, hoping to bridge the gap onto the wall. Talk about open plan architecture. Of course, all this destruction wasn't just about brute force, it was psychological warfare. When a giant trebuchet appeared on the horizon, defenders often panicked before a single stone flew. The machines became characters in the drama of war, given names like Warwolf, Evil Neighbor, or Bad Daughter. Because nothing says intimidation like being brained by a boulder from Warwolf. Here's your comic relief. Imagine the medieval OSHA inspector. Yes, I see here you're hoisting a 1-ton rock with a rope frayed to threads. Approved. But siege warfare wasn't always victory by machine. Sometimes defenders fought back creatively, using counterweighting ropes to absorb impacts, building angled walls, or even capturing enemy projectiles mid-flight in padded nets. Historians still argue whether these defenses were as effective as described, but the cat-and-mouse game of engineer versus engineer is undeniable. The night deepens, and you watch another stone sail silently through the air, black against the stars before shattering into a wall with a thunderous crack. It's mesmerizing in a terrifying way. You realize the line between myth and reality here is thin. Stories of monstrous machines sounded like fantasy, but time and experiments keep proving how clever, stubborn, and sometimes unhinged medieval engineers really were. As you turn to leave the siege camp, a soldier shouts, "Clear the line!" Another stone is loaded. You hurry down the path, ears ringing from the crash of medieval artillery behind you, and you smile grimly, thinking, in a world without gunpowder artillery, at least for a while, these wooden giants were the closest thing to apocalyptic power anyone had ever seen. You slip away from the thunder of trebuchets, following the coastline where the night air smells of salt and seaweed. The waves slap rhythmically against dark rocks, and in the distance you see low fires flickering. Drawn closer, you find a small settlement of timber-framed halls, turf-roofed huts, and longboats pulled high on the shore. The voices here carry a lilting accent, and the faces are broad, pale, and bearded. You've stumbled into one of the greatest myth-turned-fact stories of the Middle Ages, the lost Viking settlements in North America. For centuries, sagas told of Norsemen sailing far beyond Greenland to a mysterious land called Vinland. Most scholars treated the tales as legends, storytelling exaggerations, like campfire bragging about seeing a bear this big. After all, how could medieval seafarers have crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus? But here's the mainstream fact. In the 1960s, archaeologists excavated a site at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, and confirmed it was a Norse outpost dating back around the year 1000. The sagas weren't just fantasy, they were rooted in truth. The camp you see is bustling with activity. Women tend fires, men repair longboats, children chase each other with sticks. A smith hammers at an anvil, sparks showering into the night. This isn't a fleeting landing party, it's a community, however temporary. The Norse weren't just visiting, they were settling, if only briefly. Now for the quirky tidbit, the sagas mention Vinland as a place where grapes grew wild. But Newfoundland? Not exactly Napa Valley. Historians still argue whether grapes might have referred to other berries like currants, or whether the Vikings sailed even farther south into warmer zones before retreating. The exact scope of their voyages remains debated, like trying to reconstruct a road trip from half-remembered postcards. You wander down to the shoreline, where a longboat lies ready. Its sleek curves catch moonlight, its dragon-headed prow snarling defiantly at the waves. These ships were masterpieces, light enough to haul over land, strong enough to survive open seas. With them, Vikings reached not just North America, but also Iceland, Greenland, Russia, and even Constantinople. They were the Uber drivers of the medieval age, though with a slightly higher risk of plunder. Historians still argue whether the L'Anse aux Meadows site was a permanent colony or more of a base camp for expeditions. Evidence suggests ironworking, carpentry, and repairs took place, hinting at serious intentions. Yet the settlement was abandoned after only a decade or so. Perhaps conflicts with indigenous peoples, perhaps harsh winters, or simply the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across the Atlantic. And here's your comic break. Imagine being a Viking dad trying to sell the move. Kids, pack up. We're going to America. It'll be fun. No, I don't know what Wi-Fi is yet. Stop asking. As you walk through the camp, you hear snippets of the sagas retold by firelight. Stories of Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, said to have led the first expedition. He called the land Vineland for its bounty, whether berries, grapes, or just because Berryland didn't sound as epic. Others followed, like Thorfinn Karlsefni, bringing entire families in hopes of new beginnings. These weren't just raiders, they were pioneers chasing survival and opportunity. You pause by a rough-hewn hall, its smoke hole glowing faintly. Inside, men argue about the dangers of skirmishes with the Skraeling jar, the Norse term for the indigenous peoples they encountered. The sagas describe tense clashes, sometimes violent, sometimes cautious exchanges. The accounts are one-sided, of course, and historians still debate how accurate they are. But it's clear the encounters were part of why the settlement didn't last. You feel the weight of the moment. For centuries, people dismissed these stories as fables. Yet here you stand, watching sparks from a Viking forge rise into the North American night sky. Undeniable proof that myth can become history if you dig deep enough. The surf roars louder now, and you glance at the longboat again. You imagine it sliding into the dark water, sails filling with wind, prow cutting toward the unknown. The same courage or madness that carried them across oceans is still here, glowing in the eyes of the settlers. As the fires die down, you turn away, leaving the Viking outpost behind. The night swallows the camp, but in your mind the image lingers. A bridge between continents built not with stone, but with daring and wood. You leave the Viking shoreline behind, the smell of salt fading into the fragrance of herbs and smoke as you wander into a sleepy medieval hamlet. A healer's hut sits crooked by the road, its doorway hung with bundles of drying plants. Lavender, sage, maybe something that looks suspiciously like weeds pulled from the ditch. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of crushed leaves and oils. Here you step into a world where charms, amulets, and herbal pouches weren't just superstition, they sometimes worked. Here's the mainstream fact: medieval herbal medicine wasn't all nonsense. While plenty of remedies were useless or downright dangerous, others had genuine therapeutic effects. For example, willow bark was brewed for pain relief thanks to salicin, the chemical ancestor of modern aspirin. Yarrow was used to staunch bleeding, and modern science confirms it has clotting properties. These healers, without microscopes or clinical trials, sometimes stumbled on solutions that still echo in today's pharmacy aisles. You watch the healer grinding a dark root in a mortar, muttering half chant, half shopping list under her breath. She sprinkles the powder into a little linen pouch, ties it with twine, and hands it to a worried mother who presses it against her child's chest. To the medieval mind, the charm works not just because of the plant, but because of the ritual, the words, the gesture, the faith wrapped around it like a second layer of medicine. Now for your quirky tidbit, one famous remedy called Bald's Leech Book included a concoction of garlic, onion, wine, and bile from a cow's stomach to treat eye infections. Sounds like a medieval dare, but modern microbiologists actually recreated it and found it killed antibiotic-resistant bacteria like MRSA. Historians still argue whether this was a lucky accident, a lost science, or proof that trial and error knowledge was sharper than we give credit for. Either way, it makes you reconsider Grandma's secret soup recipe as potentially life-saving tech. The shelves in the hut are crowded with jars of powders, bundles of dried flowers, and strings of odd little amulets. One pouch rattles when you pick it up, filled with dried rosemary and salt. Another smells pungent, stuffed with fennel and rue. People wore these charms around their necks or hung them over doors, believing they warded off plague or evil spirits. And sometimes, though not always, they did provide benefits because certain herbs repelled fleas or improved air quality. Here's your comic breather. Picture the medieval kid who forgot his homework excuse. Sorry, teacher, my dog didn't eat it. My amulet pouch caught fire when Mom was burning sage again. Outside, the healer's garden rustles in the night breeze. Rows of plants gleam faintly in the moonlight. Comfrey, used for broken bones. Mint for digestion. Foxglove, deadly in high doses, but the ancestor of heart medicine. The line between remedy and poison was razor thin, and the healer walked it carefully, guided more by tradition than textbooks. Historians still argue whether these charms worked mostly because of chemistry or because belief itself had power. After all, if a sick person truly believed a pouch of herbs could heal them, the placebo effect might boost recovery just as much as the plant's properties. In a time when fear was often deadlier than disease, even comfort had medicinal weight. You crouch by the fire where a cauldron bubbles gently. The healer stirs, and the steam smells earthy, sharp, slightly bitter. She dips a ladle, hands you a sip, and though it tastes like chewing a dandelion stem, you feel warmth spread through your body. Maybe it's the herbs, or maybe it's the act of being cared for. Either way, you realize why people trusted in these charms, even when skeptics scoffed. As you leave the hut, The night air feels fresher, tinged with rosemary smoke. You glance back at the doorway with its dangling bundles and smile. What seemed like superstition from the outside is more complicated up close. Herbs, rituals, charms. They were survival strategies, some laughable, some brilliant, and all stitched into the fabric of medieval life. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you sip chamomile tea to calm your nerves, you'll remember the medieval healer and her pouch of fragrant leaves. And realize you're not so different after all. You leave the herb-filled hut behind, the soothing scents of rosemary and mint still clinging to your clothes, and follow a dirt track downhill toward a small village clustered around a stone well. Moonlight glints off the water's surface, silver and calm. But the people gathered nearby don't look calm at all. They mutter anxiously, whispering accusations, their eyes darting at one another. The rumor in the air is chilling. The well has been poisoned. Here's the mainstream fact. During the Middle Ages, accusations of poisoned wells were frighteningly common, especially during outbreaks of plague. In times when medical understanding was shaky at best, communities often looked for scapegoats. Wells, the lifeblood of a town, became easy targets. People claimed enemies or suspected witches had thrown toxins or cursed objects into them. Sometimes these rumors led to violent witch hunts or persecution of minorities, like Jewish communities tragically blamed for spreading plague in the 14th century. You peer into the well. The water looks clean, moonlight rippling over its surface. But fear is stronger than sight. Villagers swear the water tastes odd, that animals have died after drinking it. Some even claim to see shadows or strange scum floating. Whether real or imagined, suspicion spreads like wildfire. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some cases, wells really were poisoned, or at least contaminated. Archaeologists have found medieval wells containing animal carcasses, rotting refuse, and even curses inscribed on lead sheets dropped into the water. Imagine drawing your drinking water only to find a soggy sheet floating in it. Not exactly the crisp, refreshing spring flavor you were hoping for. Historians still argue whether deliberate sabotage was common or whether most poisonings were just natural contamination twisted into sinister rumors. The villagers bustle nervously, some clutching charms, others crossing themselves. A healer drops herbs into the water, hoping to cleanse it, while a priest mutters prayers. Fear vibrates in the air like the taut string of a bow. Wells weren't just sources of hydration, they symbolized life itself. To imagine one corrupted was to feel the ground vanish under your feet. You crouch near the edge, dipping your fingers into the water. It's cool, refreshing, perfectly ordinary. But ordinary doesn't calm panic. In an age when invisible microbes were unknown, people leaned on visible blame. If the cattle died or neighbors fell sick, it was easier to say, "The well is cursed," than to accept random misfortune. Here's your comic relief. Picture the medieval Yelp review. 1 star, water tasted funny. Neighbor accused me of witchcraft, would not recommend. You watch as the crowd debates fiercely. Some demand the well be sealed, others insist on purifying rituals. A few hotheads glare at a quiet family on the edge of the gathering, the kind of suspicion that could erupt into violence. You sense how fragile medieval communities were, teetering between survival and chaos. One whispered rumor could unravel trust overnight. Historians still argue whether belief in poison wells was a genuine reflection of medieval paranoia or a convenient excuse for political and social tensions. Was it fear of disease or fear of neighbors? Was it spiritual panic or an early recognition, however clumsy, that water could indeed carry sickness? The night deepens. The villagers scatter to their homes, and the well stands silent once more. The water gleams softly, holding both truth and myth. Maybe it's pure, maybe it's fouled. What matters is how people believed it worked, and how belief shaped their actions. As you step away, the village fades into shadow behind you. The whispers linger, though, like ripples across the well's surface. You realize that sometimes medieval myths weren't so far from reality. Wells could be poisoned by enemies, by nature, or by fear itself. And of the three, fear was often the most deadly. The village well fades into darkness, and your path carries you out into the rolling fields of England. The night feels different here, quieter, heavier, almost holding its breath. In the distance, you notice two children standing at the edge of a hollow, their small figures faintly lit by the pale glow of the moon. At first, you think your eyes are playing tricks, but as you draw nearer, you realize something uncanny. Their skin is a shade of green. Here's the mainstream fact. The story of the green children of Woolpit is one of medieval England's strangest legends. According to accounts from the 12th century, two children, brother and sister, appeared suddenly near the village of Woolpit in Suffolk. They spoke no known language, wore unusual clothing, and most startlingly, their skin was tinted green. The villagers were baffled. Eventually, the children were taken in, fed, and taught English. The boy grew weak and died young, but the girl survived, learned the language, and even integrated into local society. You look closer at the children. Their eyes are wide, their faces frightened. They flinch from the food offered by villagers, rejecting bread and meat, but nibbling hungrily when beans are brought. According to the tale, they would eat nothing but raw green beans at first, as though their very lives depended on it. Now for the quirky tidbit, one later theory suggests the children suffered from chlorosis, also called green sickness, a type of anemia that could cause a greenish tinge in the skin. Others think they were malnourished Flemish refugees who got lost, speaking their own language that villagers didn't recognize. And then, of course, there's the fringe idea that they stepped out of another world, perhaps through a hollow hill or even from beneath the earth. Historians still argue whether the Woolpit story is garbled folklore, a moral allegory, or a half-remembered truth embellished into legend. The girl, once she learned English, claimed she and her brother had come from a land where it was always twilight, where the sun never rose fully, and where everything glowed in a dusky green haze. She described hearing the sound of bells and following a path through a cavern, only to suddenly find themselves in bright daylight, disoriented and terrified. You can almost picture it, stumbling from some shadowy in-between world into the blinding English countryside. You linger by the children, imagining the villagers' reactions, suspicion, awe, fear. It was the Middle Ages, after all, when the line between natural and supernatural was wafer thin. The children might be miracles, or omens, or demons in disguise. Yet kindness won out, at least for a time, and they were cared for. The girl even grew up to marry a local man, fading quietly into history, except for the persistent whisper of her green skin. Comic breather time, you can imagine the medieval fashion advice. Darling, green is so this season. All the mysterious, interdimensional children are wearing it. But beneath the laughter, the story grips you. It feels symbolic of how medieval people viewed the unknown. Anything strange, strange colors, strange foods, strange languages, was both terrifying and magnetic. The tale of the green children distilled that fascination into human form. Historians still argue whether Woolpit's tale was a cautionary story about outsiders, a misremembered refugee crisis, or a literal encounter with something beyond our world. Each theory has holes, yet the story endures, precisely because it refuses to settle neatly into one category. As you watch the children fade back into shadow, the fields grow quiet again. The night air softens, the mystery lingering like the aftertaste of a strange fruit. You feel the tug of sleep at the edges of your mind, as though you too have wandered into a twilight land where the ordinary and the impossible blur together. Your steps slow and your voice softens, almost a whisper. You've traveled far tonight, through rivers filled with swords, courts filled with werewolves, tunnels beneath castles, and villages filled with whispered fears. You've seen healers with their charms, children marching toward doomed horizons, and legends that still puzzle even the brightest minds. Each myth unraveled a little, showing glimmers of truth beneath the dust of centuries. As the green children slip back into the shadows of Woolpit, you feel the weight of history easing. The arguments of scholars fade, the noise of superstition hushes, and what remains is only the quiet hum of human curiosity. The same spark that carried people through plagues, wars, and endless nights under the stars. You picture yourself lying down, wrapped in a warm blanket, the world outside fading into softness. The sound of the medieval world, clashing steel, chanting priests, whispers of magic, dissolves into a gentle hush, like waves on a distant shore. Your breath steadies, slow and calm, and the stories become like dreams themselves, vivid, strange, and comforting all at once. So you close your eyes, knowing the past will still be there tomorrow, waiting patiently, its mysteries intact. For now, it's enough to rest, to drift, to surrender. The journey is complete.